Hello, everyone. My name is Kylie Madhav, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I will be your moderator during tonight's panel discussion. So, again, thank you all for coming, and just sort of ground us in the conversation that we're going to have this evening. We, in January 2026, are just over 2 months out from the conclusion of the mayoral race in New York City that captured not only the attention of the 8.5 million people that call New York home, but of the entire world. This race was defined by big personalities: the charismatic community organizer with the infectious smile, the former governor who just wouldn't quit, and the New York famous public safety enthusiast with a wardrobe frozen in time from about 1984. But there was also big money at play. As per the New York City Campaign Finance Board, during the 2025 mayoral race, a total of $136 million was spent, nearly 137 million, by the candidates' campaigns and by the various political action committees that support or oppose those campaigns. In 2021, 4 years prior, that total number was just over $121 million. And in 2017, the total spent on mayoral races was $20 million. That means that in just 8 years' time, we have seen a nearly 600% increase in the amount being spent on mayoral races in New York City. To help us better understand why big money in politics matters and what it means for our cities, for our country, and for what remains of our democracy, tonight we're going to hear from a host of distinguished panelists with decades of experience in campaign finance reform, political reporting, and electoral organizing. Three members of the Move to Amend team will be joining us tonight: Jenny Spanos, Cole Bennett, and Alfonso Saldana. Jenny Spanos is co-director of Move to Amend, working to build real democracy rooted in justice, community power, and freedom from corporate rule. A former journalist turned organizer, Jenny brings decades of experience connecting environmental, economic, peace, and social justice movements in the fight for a healthier, more democratic society. Cole Bennett is also co-director of Move to Amend. He worked as a national fellow with Move to Amend while obtaining his JD from Georgia State University College of Law, and has since joined the Move to Amend national team as policy director. Cole decided to go to law school after learning about runaway corporate power and political corruption as an undergraduate at the University of Georgia. Since then, he has devoted his career to rooting out dark money in politics, overturning the disastrous Citizens United versus FEC Supreme Court decision, and making the promise of democracy manifest. Alfonso Saldana is national co-director of Move to Amend, where he works to build grassroots power to end corporate constitutional rights and curb the influence of big money in politics through the We the People Amendment. He brings a background in movement organizing, coalition building, and political education with a focus on connecting local struggles to long-term structural change. We'll also be hearing from Meghnad Bose. Meghnad is an award-winning investigative journalist with over 10 years of experience as a reporter and editor. He currently teaches journalism and heads the MA program in open source investigative reporting at the University of Memphis. He has reported on the New York City mayoral race, the Gazan genocide, and discriminatory immigration policing for publications including The Intercept, Drop Site News, and The Quint. Biplov Das is an investigative reporter who will also be with us tonight, based in New York City, whose reporting focuses on politics and business, and who has written extensively about the 2025 New York City mayoral race. He has written for Documented, Dropsite News, and Reuters, among many other outlets. Rounding out our panel is Austin Dilley. Austin is the current campaign manager for New York Assembly member Farah Souffron Forrest and is the Central Brooklyn representative to New York City's DSA Electoral Working Group and Citywide Leadership Committee. They were also deeply involved with the Zohran Mamdani campaign as a volunteer canvasser, field lead, neighborhood coordinator, and as a paid canvasser. Prior to the Zohran campaign, they were working as a line cook. We hope that tonight's webinar is as interactive as possible. So please do submit any questions that you have in the chat, and we will address them during the Q&A section at the end of our program. All sources cited during tonight's discussion will be sent to those who registered using their email following the call. So to begin tonight's conversation, I thought it might be helpful for everyone on this call to learn more about Move to Amend and the work that the organization carries out. I've already mentioned the substantial amounts of money that were spent on last year's New York City mayoral race. But Jenny, if I can pass the microphone to you, would you be able to introduce our audience to Move to Amend and say a bit about what your organization's work is to separate big money from our political process?
I think I got muted there. Sorry about that. I would love to share a little bit about who Move to Amend and what we do. Move to Amend is a national grassroots coalition of people and hundreds of organizations, hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of organizations that are working to build a real democracy. We confront how big money and corporate power shape who gets heard, who gets represented, and who needs are just ignored in our current political system. We organize across movements and communities to challenge legal rules that allow wealthy to dominate our democracy and to advance the We the People Amendment, currently HJR 54 in the House. We just picked up a new rep today. Our lead sponsor, it's 70 with our lead sponsor, Pramila Jayapal. We are an anti-oppression, pro-democracy solution. Um, it that affirms that only human beings should have constitutional rights and that money is not a form of free speech. Uh, because, the deeper truth is, right, we know that the United States has never been a full democracy. From the beginning, so many people were excluded. That's why we work um, to we work on a strategy that focuses on grassroots organizing, coalition building, political education, and local action. We work to connect strategies and struggles that are too often been treated as separate. They're connected, whether it's climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, indigenous sovereignty, and all of that to show that it's rooted in the same system of corporate control. And so by challenging corporate constitutional rights, we create a unifying target that exposes how deeply and undemocratic our current system is. So that's a little bit about Move to Amend. And I believe we'll go into more details of how we formed in response of the writing on the wall that we knew that the Supreme Court, when they pulled the Citizens United versus the FEC case back up, that how they were going to rule, because, over the last 40 years, they had continued to rule in favor of corporations over people. So uh, I'll leave it at that. And
Thank you
if you
so
have any
much.
more questions, we'll address those.
Of course. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much, for that overview. And Cole, I was wondering if you might say a bit about, since we've heard a few times about Citizens United this evening, would you be able to say a bit about how Citizens United, how the ruling in that Supreme Court case has shaped and continues to shape our social and political landscape up to the present?
Yeah, certainly. So I do want to just briefly mention that today does happen to be the 16th anniversary of Citizens United versus FEC. You mentioned that was why I chose to go to law school in the first place and just trying to figure out a way um, around it. But in terms of what it's done to our political and social landscape, it's democracy to the highest bidder, right? You see people like Elon Musk, others that are able to just completely, whether it's a C-suite of a major corporation or individual donors like Elon Musk that are able to shroud all these exorbitant amounts of money in super PACs and dark money and all these nefarious channels that have really been broken open by Citizens United, or at least the restraints that the moderate, the uh, uh, minuscule restraints that were in place already are now, completely gone. Whatever um, regulation that existed with campaign finance laws is completely thrown out the window through the past 16 years. And you see it, right? I mean, Jenny mentioned all the different things that it affects, but it really comes down to um, elected officials that aren't beholden to the people. They're beholden to money. I'll give an example. Um, Down here in Georgia, we had a big election in the past couple of years. Our two senators are Democrats, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. They're great. I had a friend that worked in the finance department of Raphael Warnock's campaign, and he said, the amount of money that went through that election, which at the time was the most that had been spent in a Senate in um, in a single Senate race, uh, has now been blown out of the water. But he said that the amount of money, there's no way they can now go. There's no way that Raphael Warnock can now go to Washington and not vote a certain way. And that's not a knock on Raphael Warnock. He usually votes, in ways that I agree with. But it's just how the system works, right? And nobody knows that more than well-meaning politicians. You know, this is kind of a segue into our next section, talking about the mayoral race. And you can call it youthful naivete if you want, but I really do see the Mamdani mayoral election and indeed his first couple days in office as a watershed moment because just 5 minutes, 30 minutes before this call, I saw a tweet about that was about how he was able to secure funding for universal child care that said, it's important to remember that government really does have a tremendous capacity and ability to benefit people. We're just to, answers of, what has this led us into a false, in some ways, sense that we can't accomplish anything. The establishment always says, well, oh, that's, there are X, Y, and Z reasons that this can't be done. I think the current administration in the White House shows you that, things are a lot more malleable than the people who are paid to do nothing or to not pass popular legislation, things that would benefit the public good that seem like no brainers. I won't name. I could give you a laundry list of what that is. But when it really gets down to it, I think we don't know what we don't have. At least not my generation. And I think that I'm really excited for the Mamdani campaign. Really, just hopefully a wave of progressive candidates that come through and really show the capacity that government has for good. But I hope that answers your question. And
No, it 100% does. And like
thank you again for moderating for a lot.
no, of course, no, no, but thank you for the work that you do and for the work that you carried out for so long and can continue to carry out. And like
Go
you
ahead, I'm
mentioned,
finished.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I might have missed something cool, but thank you so much. No, for like what you shared, and you mentioned then well, New York City, and so obviously, so Move to Amend work obviously spans across the United States. Obviously, the ruling in Citizens United, being a Supreme Court ruling, applies to all parts of the United States and all elections across the country. And I was wondering if we might sort of like pivot our attention specifically to New York, since you mentioned Mamdani so extensively. And I wanted to ask Biplab and Megnod. Now, you both followed the election very closely, and I'm wondering, what did the two of you notice with regards to how money flowing from wealthy individuals and corporations sought to influence the outcome of our city's most recent mayoral election?
Biplab, would you like to go first?
You can start off and I can add
Okay.
on.
I can, let me quickly try and share my screen then. Okay, and let me know if y'all can see it. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes, it's showing up for me.
Okay, and you can see the slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I mean, you asked about the money, and here's the money. This was the, like you said, there was a lot of money. Let me just minimize. Yeah, there was a lot of money spent on this election, and there was a significant amount of money spent by the campaigns. Now, you'd want the campaigns to be able to spend, and they also get matching funds from the city depending on how much they raise. The city sort of supplements that to give candidates a fighting chance. $72 million were spent by the campaigns themselves. And you also have what is known as outside spending or independent spending, which is spending done by super PACs and folks who are not supposed to be officially coordinating with the campaigns. Now, we know there are violations of this all the time. Some violations are reported and investigated and lead to fines, but it's a sort of like we said in the previous version of this panel that it's a very trust me bro kind of vibe to sort of monitoring this, whether the super PACs for a candidate that are pouring in millions and millions of dollars are actually coordinating with the campaign. So how did the candidates stack up against each other? So if you look at the campaigns, for the Mamdani campaign, the campaign actually had $16.5 million. A lot of this money was through matching funds provided by New York City. And for Cuomo, similar amount, $14.5 million. But here's where it gets tricky. When it comes to outside money, the independent expenditures, there were $6.5 million spent in ads and other forms of communication to voters that was for Mamdani or against Cuomo. So basically benefiting the Mamdani campaign. In contrast, there was $52.5 million spent against the Mamdani campaign or in favor of the Cuomo campaign, thereby benefiting disgraced former governor Andrew Cuomo. Um, Now, when you add the two up, you see the disparity. The Zohran Mamdani campaign, therefore, had effectively $23 million going for it, either through the campaign or through super PACs and other sort of outside expenditures. Whereas the Andrew Cuomo campaign had more than $67 million effectively backing it through its campaign and through outside expenditures. This disparity makes it obscenely difficult, disproportionately difficult for candidates that don't have the backing of big corporates to contest the election in a fair and square manner. Sure, like the ballots are all getting counted fairly and whoever's casting their vote is getting to cast their vote. All of that is fine, but at a fundamental level, who's getting more money to be able to influence voters with ads? Who's being able to give out more print ads, more TV ads, more ads every time you open up YouTube, more ads when you open up social media, more money spent on putting forth their points? So, this disproportion that we see is always going to benefit the candidates who big corporates, big companies, big money interests, big lobbies back. In this election, despite what the popular sort of sentiment on the ground clearly was, that money went behind Andrew Cuomo and against a candidate who called himself a democratic socialist, was talking about policies like universal childcare, fast and free buses, and so on and so forth. Instead, it went against opposing a candidate with a socialist worldview and making the playing field, one would argue, not so level.
I can take on from what Meghnad just mentions. I feel like one of the bigger lessons that these mayoral election, the New York City mayoral elections taught us that, and by the slides that Meghna just showed you guys, that if you are to assess the campaign purely in terms of matching funds, one would say that it would give us a picture of what would look like an ideal election or an ideal democracy where money, in fact, would not dilute electioneering, right? However, the moment you add Super PAC into the mix, you see the outsized impact of these outside groups, that they have in influencing these campaigns, often making or breaking campaigns, as we have seen across the country. Now, if I have to elaborate a little more on how these corporations, how billionaires sort of spent their money and where it went towards targeting Nani or backing Andrew Cuomo. Uh, I feel like the spending patterns show us the super PACs, the spending patterns of these super PACs express kind of two distinct blocks that were kind of two or three distinct blocks that were kind of backing Andrew Cuomo. Now, New York, despite being one of the bluest states, heavy Democrat, one of the biggest blocks that we saw supporting Andrew Cuomo, targeting Mamdani, were ardent donors of Donald Trump and the backers of the MAGA movement. We see that donors like Bill Ackman, the hedge fund billionaire of Pershing Square Capital, who was the primary force behind one of the biggest super PACs against Mamdani called Defend NYC. He spent around $2 million against Mamdani. Uh, and some very peculiar spending at that too. At one point, our reporting found that at one point, Defend NYC sent a text blast which said, uh, which had a screenshot of a tweet by a woman. The tweet said, Cuomo murdered my husband and I am voting for him. That's how bad things are in New York. That's the tweet that they sent as a text blast to New York City residents. And it said, the super PAC said, we know what she means. And if she can do it, you can do it too. And they also ran ads that called Cuomo flawed, but said that he was the only choice to prevent communism from coming into New York City. We also had another MAGA billionaire, Joe Gebbia, who is a co-founder of Airbnb. And in fact, he was appointed by Donald Trump into Doge. Remember when it was a thing, right? Um, and he spent around $2 million funding anti-Mamdani super PACs. A second block of big donors who didn't want Mamdani to win and were funding anti-Mamdani campaigning was uh, were pro-Israel billionaires, right? The Lauder family, who run the Estee Lauder conglomerate of skincare and perfume luxury brands. They spent that family spent over $2.5 million in anti-Mamdani super PACs. The biggest donations from the Lauder family came from Joe Carroll Lauder and Ronald Lauder. Ronald Lauder was the former chairman of Estee Lauder International, and he has also been the longtime president of a strident pro-Israel group called the World Jewish Congress. If you have to identify a third block of backers of Andrew Cuomo, or ones who didn't want Mamdani to win, are those who have a disproportionate stake in New York City politics, or in other words, it's just known as Michael Bloomberg, right? The former mayor. He spent over $10 million supporting Fix the City. Now, remember, Fix the City was the same super PAC that artificially lengthened Zohran Mamdani's beard in their advertisement. Um, you also have to remember that Bloomberg was the biggest individual contributor to the Democratic Party in the lead up to the 2024 presidential elections. He spent over $60 million in the election cycle from the 2023-2024 election cycle. In this instance, however, Bloomberg continued to spend millions against Mamdani even after Mamdani secured the Democratic nomination for mayor. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that incredibly in-depth overview, from both of you. And I'm going to go for something of a low-hanging fruit in terms of a question, but why do you think that there would have been so many millionaires and billionaires who would have been quite so motivated to not see a socialist assume the most powerful office in New York City? If you had to guess, what might billionaires have been why might they have been incentivized for Mamdani to not win this past year?
I mean, if you ask, if you have one candidate saying that he's going to impose a higher tax rate on billionaires, you'd expect billionaires to probably not want to part with their with even a slight fraction, additional fraction of their money. The point isn't that they shouldn't get to vote against a candidate who proposes such a tax. The point is that because of the sort of, again, obscene influence that their money has, they can then disproportionately impact or influence the views of other voters who otherwise may absolutely want that billionaire tax, right? But who are then getting plastered with ads saying that, for example, Zohran Mamdani is going to make New York City unsafe. And they might have sort of views that I mean, like most New Yorkers would, that they want a safe New York City, right? So if you keep getting ads every time you open your phone, every time you open the newspaper, every time you open the television set, that Zohran Mamdani is going to be terrible for public safety, maybe you wonder, even though you might want a billionaire tax, you might think that, okay, maybe Mamdani is not the person for you, right? Or not the candidate for you. So it's the billionaires who have very narrow self-interests for specific policy goals that they would like to see in effect or continue to be in effect, who then try to impact the electorate by influencing them on other issues that they know then that electorate would be more prone or more susceptible to being influenced on, if that makes sense.
No, it 100% does. I'm sorry, like my flub, like I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I
Just
was
a
done. Yeah,
small,
yeah. Oh,
yeah,
because
just a small addition to Meghna. There's also, I feel a lot of the spending and the way that we have seen how ads are designed and sort of like, presented through these campaign, so through the super PACs, we see also an undermining of the intelligence of the American voter. Like it is like assumed by billionaires like that, some of these grossly grossly false, things that are perpetrated by super PACs are going to work, and sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they do, but in a city like New York this year, when there was a grassroots mobilization, undertaken by a absolutely grassroots movement, it did not, and I feel like that also would, like, uh, probably later in the conversation, give us fuel for the Mamdani model as we speak it in terms of campaign finance. Yeah.
yeah, and to give you like this example of, like, say for example, DoorDash were one of the big donors against Mamdani, right? Donating to super PACs. And I mean, again, I don't want to take up too much time, but if I can just quickly share the screen and show you that how people can look at it and find out when they see an ad like this, if you just pause, and not everyone's going to do it, but if you're interested, if you pause towards the end of the ad or where this text sort of comes in, you can see it's paid for by Fix the City. But here, the top three donors to the organization responsible for this ad are DoorDash, right, at number one. And to answer your question, Kylie, why does DoorDash have such a disproportionate interest? Because they were likely fearful that a Mamdani mayoralty might mean that the administration, the mayoral administration, sort of looks at the plight of delivery workers in the city and whether they're getting fairly paid, whether they're in living sort of safe working conditions. We've seen so many instances regarding unsafe practices and policies being brought on, making delivery workers more vulnerable. Now, DoorDash has a very direct interest, a financial interest, in likely not wanting that to happen, right? And so you see these big corporations, these big billionaires come in again to serve their very narrow special interests. But what was the ad about? Was it about delivery workers? No. It was calling Zohran Mamdani risky for public safety.
Mm. Well, I mean, isn't it the irony of ironies that they don't want to pay their workers better, but they will throw a few million at trying to defeat a socialist candidate? It just beggars belief, doesn't it? I mean, and I feel like the amount of money that was spent in the race, I mean, the sums were so absurd, they really do bear repeating. And so with that, I'm going to just say it again. Pro Andrew Cuomo PACs, political action committees in the 2025 race spent over $30 million in pro Cuomo messaging during the campaign. Conversely, just over 1 million was spent by PACs on anti-Cuomo messaging. On the same foot or in the same vein, anti-Mamdani PACs spent over $21 million on anti-Mamdani messaging, while only just over 4 was spent on pro-Mamdani messaging. Despite this, Mamdani, as we all know, won over 50% of the vote in a three-way race, no less, during the general election. So, given how frequently the largest spender in a political race tends to be the one who comes out victorious, I'm curious, Austin, what do you think made the difference for Mamdani? And I ask you, right, because given that you were one of the campaign's most prolific field directors, can you give us some insight into the campaign's field operations and your thoughts on how this field operation might have influenced the election's ultimate outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I think rightfully so, a lot of attention has been paid to Zoran's comms, to his videos on social media, to the way he went viral and blew up. And I think that's really important. It's how I got early people like myself out of whatever else we are doing in our lives and onto the doors. But I will say, and this has luckily gotten more attention in the past months, especially after the general, is that the ground game of the campaign is really what made up the distance in that fundraising, especially in the early days. I'm talking December, January, February, specifically that we weren't going door to door asking for money. We were expecting donations, but that wasn't the ask. The ask was just to get out there and talk to people about politics early and as quickly as possible. And the other thing I want to point out is that in his fundraising in the primary, he stopped fundraising after he hit $1 million because that's the max you can match in the New York City Campaign Finance Board. So he made very clear that he wasn't going to take big money and that he also wasn't going to fundraise insane amounts because he didn't need to. And I think that combined with this very strong ground game of sending people out and just being able to completely subvert this spending, not through outrageous fundraising them from small donor donations around the country or running different ads or better ads or more social media, but sending a real person to someone's door to explain that no, this person you see on the news 15 times a day and they're calling him terrible and horrible and violent and anti-Semite and he wants to abolish the police, et cetera, et cetera. The person you're now affiliating with that candidate is someone who came to your door and talked to you about three very simple things: freezing the rent, making buses fast and free, and providing universal childcare. And then we were able to say on the doors, and this is how the messaging against big money and against corporations all really tied in, is that, and he wants to pay for it only by taxing the wealthiest New Yorkers. And to boot, he's refusing to take any money from these big corporate donations. And I think it's really hard to overestimate how important real estate money is in the New York City political scene. There's not been a candidate in years who has run a race this large and this popular who hasn't taken large money from the real estate industry, and he didn't. And that made a really big difference on the doors because it wasn't just that like, whatever young progressive kid was coming to your door in January to talk to you about these like pie in the sky ideas. They were coming with a candidate who was really about it. And I think it was those things in combination, right? We knocked a million doors in the primary. By the end of primary weekend, we were knocking like 100,000 doors a week, at least. I think there was one weekend where we knocked over 100,000 in 2 days. We tried to break our record in the general, and we got to like something insane, like over 50,000 doors in one day. So like the scale of this operation really ballooned and ballooned and ballooned. And I think that is the reason we were able to get around this kind of media push. And I think looking back on it, like in the primary, everyone stacked up against us for the most part. Most of the big rank and file unions, who are traditionally fairly conservative and not politically out there, stacked up against us. We did get DC 37 thanks to internal organizing. But the thing that made the difference in the amount of money that was spent against him was just this ability to go out and do the basics, the basic fundamentals of organizing, which is talking to someone, convincing them to do something. In this case, it was convincing them to vote, and then it was convincing them to come out and volunteer and bringing their friends. So you really built this social environment and really a whole social world around a certain kind of political engagement that I don't think any of us have really seen in our lives in a very, very long time, right? Because it wasn't just you would come to a rally and it wasn't just you would cut a check. It was like, we want you to come and we want you to participate and engage in your local democratic structures and a very flourishing version of democracy that we don't really see, especially post Citizens United, where fundraise like the entire point of campaigns is fundraising. And even our progressives have gotten really good at fundraising. I think AOC's last haul was like $14 million, right? And this is a little bit of a tangent, so I want to apologize, but I think a lot about Shirley Chisholm's 1970s presidential run. And one of her campaign platforms was that all races should be publicly funded, that there should be no private funding, that there should be no private donations. And obviously that's like the farthest end of what this could mean. But I think the core there is that politics should be devoid of the influence of money in a society where it is so uneven of who has access to capital and who doesn't. There's something very profound about saying that no, our elections, our democracy should be separate from that. And obviously we're nowhere near that right now, but I think that's something that this campaign was trying to get at. that like he stopped fundraising. And I think that to me, I think was the point in the primary where he really blew up. Because everyone's like, oh, all candidates want is money. They want to make money for their friends and etc. And Zoran got to the point where he said, I mean, he made this incredible video. I don't know how many folks saw it, where he told people to stop giving him money. And I think that was really profound and it talks to a very like major political shift in what might happen in the next years, but really what this campaign was about.
No, 100%. That's such a powerful example of just like the power of sort of like getting people like and not only sort of like to support a campaign via like small dollar donations or doing or like voting sort of like once every couple of years, but to give them a sense of being bought into the not just the outcome of the election, but the actual like shaping of the campaign itself, which is I think something quite genius that Mamdani and his team pulled off. And sort of like related to that. You mentioned the video that he put out when he said, please stop donating. We've hit our like $1 million, and this is the most that we can get in terms of matching funds. And I'm wondering, Megnat or Biplab or anyone who feels confident speaking on this topic, could you say a bit more about the matching funds program and exactly like what that looks like? Why was that unique? And again, why that's relevant to our conversation today?
Yeah, Kylie, before that, if I could just add very quickly to add to Austin's point, um, like it's not just New York, right? We're seeing young progressive candidates look at fundraising with a different lens and sort of voters often sort of appreciating that, right? So you have Kat Abu-Ghazaleh, who's a 26-year-old running for Congress in Illinois. What Abu Ghazaleh did was use campaign funds, I beg your pardon, to feed people in need for community kitchens in Illinois. And while saying that so much money gets wasted in politics, right? Now that is such a seemingly radical move to make people aware that hell yeah, why are we spending $136 million on an election when so many of New York's problems can be attempted to be fixed with such a huge investment, right? And at one point, Mamdani himself sort of said uh, that some of these billionaires who are threatening to leave New York if he wins might be better served if they stop spending so much money against him because they're spending more money than what he would actually tax them than the additional tax increase. But to answer your question about matching funds, very simply, it's basically to level the playing field between different candidates, and it allows individuals who raise certain amounts of money, contributions of certain amounts. It gives you up to 8 times that amount, which is known as a matching amount. So basically, it levels the playing field for a candidate who might have a great platform but isn't doesn't have as much in terms of campaign finance. So that 16 million versus 14 million you saw in the Mamdani versus Cuomo comparison earlier, that would have been several millions lower for the candidates, and which would have again disproportionately impacted the Mamdani campaign had matching funds not existed.
On that same topic, what about ranked choice voting? Like, I feel like that's something that we haven't quite touched on in terms of one of the factors that might have affected, well, the primary especially. But what influence do you think that ranked choice voting had on the outcome of the election in terms of like helping New York City not reelect another Cuomo?
I feel like to I wanted to add something to Meghnad's point, and then probably like also add a bit on the ranked choice voting, which is that if you look at matching funds, it also sort of gives you a sense of who is the actual really the a genuinely popular candidate on the ground, right? Because the way to get more matching funds is also to kind of expand as much as you can so that it matches how much you can raise based on how many people you can incorporate in your movement, right? And how many people you can get to donate for you or small donations. So that also gave an indication of why Mamdani was so successful because he was running this grassroots organization, and he he raised more in terms of matching funds, and the funds that he had himself was higher than what Cuomo in fact was able to raise. That's one thing. And in terms of ranked choice voting, I feel like we have seen in at least the primaries where ranked choice voting was there. Uh, uh, we saw how everyone kind of we knew that that Andrew Cuomo was had way higher name recognition. He was the former governor of the state of New York State. So all these other progressive candidates who had kind of come together with putting out one message, which was that yes, we want you to vote for me, but at the same time, because we have ranked choice voting, please opt out Andrew Cuomo. And I feel like that kind of did dent his chances. And Brad Lander, who was the third most popular candidate in the primaries, in the Democratic primaries, his vote, he kind of probably got the sense that Mamdani had a real shot. He was within striking distance. So he went out and told his voters that rank Mamdani second. And that's what we saw. And although, it turned out that Mamdani didn't even need that either, but it turned out that it did help, keep Cuomo away. So yeah.
Well, absolutely. And so, of course, ranked choice voting, matching funds, an amazing field operation, all of those factors came together and obviously got Mamdani over the finish line. He's in office now. But of course, that's not the end of the story, is it? Right? So the moneyed interests that we've discussed, DoorDash and the Bloombergs of the world, if I had to guess, they're probably not going to go and fade quietly into the night while they allow the seat of the American financial industry to blossom into a socialist utopia, if I had to guess. Some have hearkened back to the story of Dennis Kucinich in Cleveland, Ohio, as a cautionary tale of the challenges that may lie ahead for the Mamdani administration as it endeavors to govern. Alfonso, I was wondering if you might be able to tell us a bit tonight about Dennis Kucinich and what happened during his mayoralty in Cleveland.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. So to understand the challenges facing a reform-minded administration today, I think it's helpful to look back at what happened in Cleveland under the Dennis Kucinich administration. So in the late 1970s, Kucinich was a young grassroots-backed mayor who came into office during a period of economic decline and fiscal stress. And so one of the central issues he faced was the feature of Cleveland's publicly owned electricity company, Money Light. So a lot of powerful financial and corporate interests wanted the city to sell off the electricity company to private utility. However, Kucinich refused, and that decision to keep the public asset in the public hands became a trigger for what followed, which was almost immediately. Cleveland's banks refused to roll over the city's short-term debt, and this wasn't actually because the city lacked real estate assets or revenue. It was because access to credit was being used as a leverage, and a financial crisis was effectively manufactured as a way to create pressure and shift the story. The media immediately started to frame Kucinich as a reckless and an ideological politician, and political allies started to peel away from Kucinich. What looked like a technical financial dispute was actually a form of discipline, a form of punishment for resisting privatization. So I think that the key lesson from Cleveland is that municipal debt and financial institutions don't just respond to politics, they enforce boundaries around what kinds of decisions and considered as acceptable. And public ownership definitely crossed a line for them. So to me, what is striking about all of this is that this happened decades before Citizens United. So today, with corporate power even more entrenched and constitutionally protected, the same dynamics can unfold faster and more quietly with fewer visible villains. And Cleveland shows that winning office doesn't end the fight. In many cases, that is actually when the real pressure begins.
If I could keep the spotlight on you a bit for a second on phone, so I'd love to know what are your thoughts, right? So you mentioned a sort of like public ownership crisis and how that was essentially used to manufacture a fiscal crisis that led to the downfall of a progressive candidate back in Ohio in the 70s. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how can a progressive politician who's in office balance visionary policy goals with the political realities of entrenched corporate and financial interests? Very much relevant to the case of New York, I would say.
Yeah, so I think what we can learn from Kucinich isn't simply that public ownership is good, but actually that public ownership threatens profit expectations and system organized around profit will respond accordingly. So in Cleveland, the backlash wasn't about Dennis Kucinich personally or his rhetoric. It was structural. So the moment the city refused to privatize the electric company, financial institutions step in to enforce discipline. So that tells us something important. Retaliation doesn't come because reform are unpopular, but because they cross ownership lines that capital assumes are non-negotiable. I guess the lesson that we can take from this is that reforms need to take more than just voter support and good messaging. They need insulation, protection from the financial and legal mechanisms that allow corporate and banking interests to override democratic decisions after the elections are over. I think that's why Move to Amend focuses on the constitutional layer of this problem. Without changing the rules, the elevated corporate powers and the money in politics are going to be repeating themselves city after city. Kucinich's story isn't a cautionary tale. It's more of a warning of what can happen when democratic control runs headfirst into systems designed to defend the private power.
And I guess, we here in New York State, we're especially fortunate because not only are we the heart of American capital and as you said, with the many entrenched financial interests, but we also have an electoral calendar that puts our gubernatorial election immediately after our mayoral election. So it's just 2 straight years of fun here in New York State, right? So this year, our centrist governor is running for re-election in a race where her main challenger is actually her own lieutenant governor who's positioning himself to her left politically and rhetorically. And I'm wondering, this question is open to anyone who wants to jump at it first. What effect do you feel that the dynamics of the governor's race might have on the first year of the Mamdani administration's ability to govern, given that much of what Mamdani promised must pass through Albany to actually become law?
I think it's a golden opportunity that the Mamdani administration has welcomed with both hands. And you saw that. I mean, Kathy Hochul right now is desperate for the votes of Democrat-leaning voters in New York City. And I mean, for those who may not be from New York or might not be as acquainted with New York politics, it's New York City that is deeply blue, but then there are several parts of upstate New York which sort of reliably vote red, right? And so any sort of aspirant for governor, sure, wants to pick up votes in upstate New York as well, but the Democratic candidates have to rely heavily on shoring up support and getting people to turn out for them in New York City. And Kathy Hochul, first week of the Mamdani administration, comes out and jointly announces an expanded childcare program, right? And is being seen with Mamdani more and more, is sounding supportive of Mamdani more vocally, and is helping pass through some of these critical measures that Mamdani promised but needed Hochul's support or the governor's support to get through. So I think politically, it's a huge opportunity for the Mamdani administration to cash in and be able to pressure Hochul to sort of side with a very popular mayoral administration in the city.
If I may, if I may add something, I was reporting from the rally in Queens last year, just before the mayoral elections, where AOC and Bernie had appeared, where Katie Hochul also delivered a speech. There was a rally where the entire crowd erupted the moment Katie Hochul, started delivering his speech, tax the rich, tax the rich, tax the rich. And Hochul was like, I'll see what I can do, something on those lines. And it was an electric environment. And I was speaking to a lot of people. And I feel like, in that moment, starting at before the primaries, where Katie Hochul was refusing to accept Mamdani's taxation policy, like that his tax proposals for the state, uh, to kind of recognizing in that moment probably that Mamdani has more leverage, in fact, within the Democrats at this point, and he has way more leverage than Katie Hochul, and she needs it because the elections are upcoming, and I feel like to deliver on Mamdani's agenda, I agree with Meghnad, that to deliver on his agenda in the city, the elections would serve as a great leverage for Mamdani to pull off some of his core agenda, one of which he has already made considerable success, and the others, I feel like he can pull it off if he uses it. He has to use his political acumen well, and I trust he will, given his record in the past year. Yeah.
And Mamdani's also benefited Hochul in an indirect way. So that meeting, which I'm guessing all of us saw between Mamdani and Trump in the White House, this huge sort of camaraderie that Trump tried to show with him, and this seeming affection that he had for Mamdani, even allowing him to agree that he with the reporter's question that he's a fascist. But after that sort of, I mean, a Republican candidate for governor in New York would want the president's full-throated support, and sort of criticisms against what Hochul represents, what the Democrats represent, what Mamdani represents in New York City, and to sort of for that having blunted out, having been blunted out with that weird meeting in the White House, it sort of took away some of the gust that a potential Republican candidate might have had. And I mean, days after, not necessarily because of it, but maybe in some part influenced by it, Elise Stefanik dropped out of the gubernatorial race, of the Republican race, to be the GOP candidate in the state. So there are so many moving pieces here, but I would say that it only represents a big opportunity for the New York City mayoralty to take advantage that we have a governor's election in the state coming up.
And I would say it's important to, multiple leaders. It keeps from isolating, right? And targeting. If you have, depending on who gets into office or who wins that race. So I think it'd be really important and really powerful. Also, locking in some of these reforms, like you said, you can't do it. And I don't know how the structure is in New York, but I mean, broadly speaking, that's the kind of thing that needs to happen, um, for the movement to be successful there, right? And also a sustained ground game. And also maintaining that, being able to maintain the direction, the narrative, is really important. So if an allied, so to speak, gets into that position or stays in that position or moves to the left, I think that it would be a great opportunity.
100%. And just like thank you all for like what you've shared here. Like obviously the story about Dennis Kucinich is a very sort of somber one for the left, but I think that we can all take some amount of joy from knowing that Elise Stefanik was forced to drop her bid for governor in a very embarrassing and public way because of the situation. So small rays of sunshine there. And you mentioned the field operation, Jenny, and Austin, this question is for you because you spoke about the effect of Mamdani's field operation on the outcome of the 2025 mayoral race. But you also mentioned AOC and sort of like how she's run her races in New York City. And I was wondering if you might be able to share a bit about AOC's small dollar campaign funding model and whether you see this as something as this is a replicable sort of like way to outmaneuver moneyed interests in other races, both in the city and perhaps beyond the five boroughs.
Yeah, I think that's a smart question. I think what AOC has been doing fundraising wise is first of all really impressive just for like quantity of small donor donations and keeping a small overall um, individual donation. But I think the key to what she's been doing is a way to nationalize local races. She's pulling in a lot of money all over New York, but also like she's a national figure and leverages that into these small donor donations. Because I think for a lot of people not in New York or not in a progressive place, they're looking for progressive representatives at a national level, and AOC is kind of able to tap into that. And I think she's also really just harkening back to like Bernie's first two runs. This was the core of it, right? Like the old like $27 average donation that a lot of campaigns still use as like one of their benchmark donor levels. But really this idea that like there is more of us than there are of them. And we will never be able to fundraise them, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that doesn't mean we can't still raise enough money to run really important campaigns. Um, and I'll also say Zohran's field plan and the ecosystem that emerged out of the New York City DSA is the same one that propelled AOC to her first win. And it's the same model of organizing that is really based in volunteer power, but also trusting volunteers to come in at the base level as like I did as a just a door knocker, and then you gain expertise and you gain leadership to the point where hopefully you're not just an engaged voter anymore, you're an engaged organizer. And not only an engaged organizer, maybe you end up working on a campaign and becoming involved as you can. And that it's really about taking ownership as working class people, as individuals, away from this narrative of politics is only for elites or only for the highly educated or only for the wealthy. And I think that's a lot of what we see in OC's messaging. I think it's a lot of what we've seen in Bernie's messaging. And it's kind of this messaging that in a lot of ways is a response to Citizens United of what happens to our democracy when it gets taken over by big money and how can we combat it. And the way we do that is by leveraging the amount of people we know that are supportive of these candidates. And we don't need them to give $1,000. You need to give 5 or 25, and that snowballs, and that allows us to really combat these single donations that ask a lot of people.
Absolutely. And sort of just like related to this, and this question is for you, but for the whole panel as well. I'm wondering what your all's like what you all's thoughts are in terms of, obviously like Move to Amend, like as an organization is an organization that cares deeply about campaign finance reform. And I think probably all of us on this call think this is a very important issue in terms of the health and stability, quite frankly, of our democracy. But I'm wondering what you all's thoughts are in terms of as electoral strategy. Do you think that sort of centering issues around campaign finance in electoral messaging during a campaign is an effective strategy potentially for progressive candidates to run and win? And I'm thinking specifically of the example of Sarahana Shrestha, a fellow, SIO in our DSA lingo, who ran a campaign in the Mid-Hudson Valley in New York State, which for those of us that don't live in this region, it's sort of like the northern suburbs of New York, not necessarily sort of like deep red, but not necessarily sort of deep blue like New York City, so somewhere in between, more purplish. And so one of the sort of like strategy points that her comms team used was that they sort of like looked at who was funding their opponent, and if they found company X was doing it, they would make a big deal of it and say, look, this person who I believe was the incumbent as well, like correct me if I'm wrong, Austin, but I think her opponent like was the incumbent in that case. But they were pointing out how this person, who says he's like working for you as a public servant, look at all the money that he's taking from like corporation X or corporation Y, and like who do you think that he's actually going to be beholden to as he's serving? Like why do you think things haven't changed, so on and so forth in your community? Obviously, there were other factors at play, but that messaging strategy was part of a successfully run campaign. And so I'm wondering if you think that there is potentially, right, so there's the need for a constitutional amendment, right? There's a need for sort of like campaign finance reform at all levels of government. All that is true. But do you think there's sort of like a way to sort of like apply pressure on campaign finance reforms, sort of like from the bottom up by making it politically toxic to be known to take money from corporations?
I feel like
Uh, Go ahead,
go ahead,
Cole.
Austin. Well, I just feel like I can answer this uh, hopefully pretty well. That at Move to Amend, what we're really trying to do is seed a democracy movement from the ground up. Of I think our fundamental undertaking really is, at least right now, is education. So many people just don't know about what Citizens United is, what it did, or I think they have a sense that there's something wrong. Oh, they're all corrupt or whatever, but like they don't know the actual mechanisms of how they're corrupt. And I think, to your point, shining a light on that, whether it's there's people that do the congressional stock trading tracking, or just starting to have mechanisms of like integrity indexes and all this stuff. If we are able to just collectively make this a big enough issue, make Citizens United a big enough issue, campaign financing, corruption. I mean, it doesn't have to have the dressings of campaign finance. I mean, it's corruption. It's plain and simple. I mean, again, I hate to keep referencing him, but like, look who's in the White House right now. I mean, people can see that, and it's right in front of their face. I think just making that connection, helping people that just that little bit, when we tell people about the We the People Amendment and what we're doing, I would say almost, I mean, conservatively, 9 out of 10 people are like, oh, absolutely, I 100% agree with you. It's just a matter of people not knowing what the problem is, or what the solution is. And so I really think if there's anything that people can take away from this call, along with all the wonderful things that have been said already, is like raise this up and ask, figure out who these candidates are beholden to, and challenge them on it. Ask them how they, what's their stance on campaign financing, on who they get their money from. And I think really just centering that, and centering the people is, this it's kind of the big task. But just, the people is who these people are supposed to represent. That's why they're called representatives. But yeah, anyway, I just feel like raising up those issues and making, giving them the attention that they deserve is at least a facet of this moving forward.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that. And something I want to touch on that you mentioned at the beginning is I think something that happened in the field program is we were able to use it as an educational outreach tool in a lot of ways. It wasn't just we're going to tell people about this candidate. We are also doing like education about who he was, but also about the political sphere largely. And that ranked choice voting allowed us to do a little bit of that as well. But I will also say, while I do agree that campaign finance laws should be stricter in both places, and not supporting this is akin to supporting corruption, and the way people deal with money in politics is a corrupt system. I will also say I don't think that in and of itself is an easily electoralizable issue. Like I don't think a candidate necessarily wins just because they want to root out corruption, not because it's not politically salient, but because I think people are going to increasingly vote for issues that depend and affect on their lives. And I think the reason Zoran did so well is because he was just absolutely unrelenting on this question of the cost of living, on life being too expensive and life being too hard. And wrapped up in that was a discussion of corruption, of campaign finance. We were in some ways blessed to go against two deeply corrupt and terrible politicians, right? Like Eric Adams received no campaign finance matching funds because the board deemed him too corrupt to receive them. And Andrew Cuomo was fined or had restricted $400,000 in matching funds, right? So we're up against candidates who we could clearly paint a line with. And the other thing I want to say is that one of the, I think, kind of unexpected benefits of very transparent campaign finance laws, like New York City has and New York State has, is actually allows us to do a lot of research into who's supporting our candidates, right? Independent expenditures a lot of times are just black holes to funnel money in, and you have to spend a lot of time researching who those people are. But I know in New York City, especially, campaigns have been able to like do deep research on their opponents and then use that as comms for their own campaigns. And this is becoming popular in other places, specifically in DSA run campaigns. Kelsey Bond, who ran for city council in Atlanta this past year and won against corporate real estate money, one of the main points of that campaign was researching and highlighting who was giving to the opponent. And that became part of the narrative of the campaign of running a small people power campaign and using campaign finance laws as a way to encourage transparency, and then using that transparency against your opponents. I think it's a very smart way to go about it.
Um,
The environment. Yes.
yeah, I was
Um,
just going
I,
to. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no, you first.
All right, thanks. I was just going to add that uh, to Austin's points. Like I would say, Zohran Mamdani's election success is, in fact, I feel like it's the second major election in the past couple of years where the Democratic establishment learned the hard way that more money raised or outspending on doesn't necessarily mean electoral success, right? The first one was Kamala Harris' prolific loss, despite outraising Donald Trump. If you think about it. Mamdani's election also showed that you do not need hundreds or tens of millions of dollars to pull off a very successful election campaign. I mean, Kylie had mentioned before how his messaging, how the money that was spent was going for a pro Mamdani agenda based on issues rather than an anti Cuomo messaging. Like 83% of the money that Mamdani's supporters spent, outside groups spent, was focused on supporting his message and spreading his message. And only 17% of that was kind of involved in calling out Cuomo. And I feel like that is at the heart of the Mamdani model. Like, first comes garnering that grassroots support, like mobilizing hundreds of thousands of volunteers, knocking on the doors, and creating that political will. Just the hard work, like involvement in political life, and stepping out, and talking to people, and raising questions of who is funding the other candidates, stuff like that. But more importantly, the second is centering the message on a positive agenda, an agenda that can ignite kind of hope and affirms a positive change over an agenda that merely promises a replacement to authoritarianism, I guess. Yeah.
Could I very quickly add something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was saying I have a bit of skepticism about sort of not necessarily. I mean, I guess underplaying the amount of importance big money has from seeing the headline of a victory or a headline of a loss, because when you see the Mamdani campaign, they had 104,000 volunteers. 104,000. They were getting what, like 9 people to vote for Mamdani per person, including themselves. That is an unreal number. You will not be able to replicate that number. And someone pointed out in the comments, it's going to be difficult to replicate that in non-urban areas, for instance, right? Where you have like sort of houses and homes at like sort of distances from one another, right? Not so concentrated, where you can just like 5 people go door knocking, they can cover 50 homes in a few hours, right? So there are inherent challenges. And remember, Mamdani's ground game wasn't just slightly better than Cuomo's or 2x better. Like, I mean, it's hard to put a number in it, but it was like probably like 50x better than Cuomo's, right? Like for the primary, Cuomo's campaign was nowhere on the ground. Mamdani's campaign was in lots of places. For the general, Mamdani's campaign was everywhere. And Cuomo's campaign tried, but they still couldn't match up. The final vote share was 50 and 42%. Now, it's not always that more ground game is very neatly going to correlate to more votes, right? But it was a close election at the end of the day. And what made it a close election, one of the things has to be the amount of money that the many $1 million Cuomo's sort of pro Cuomo folks outspent pro Mamdani folks by. So I would be slightly skeptical to say that just because some candidates have strong ground games and they've overcome the odds means that we should not sort of look at this larger constitutional amendment with sort of increased focus. These victories don't the point to a counter to the need or to move to amend. They in fact show exactly why there is a need to move to amend.
I think you make an excellent point there because, you can't just plan to win elections. You know, we recognize, I think the Kachin decision or, situation, and I'll just say Venezuela in that conversation real quick. And, so Mamdani stays away from that. He just, I'm kidding. But to recognize that you're going to have to govern in conflict, right? Um, and defend the democratic structures you put in place, but also what we are seeing there is the delivery of tangible wins immediately, right? And that's really important. I think that's a real important aspect to the success of his campaign and a model for others to follow. Once you get into, you can't just plan to win. You have to look and think about, like you said, the long term vision. Where do we want to go? How are we going to keep control, democratic control, the people controlling something? Um, and there's going to have to be constitutional reform in there. There's just no, right now, you know, Citizens United was built on precedents. It's not just the Citizens United decision that equated money to speech. That wasn't even the first time the Supreme Court had equated money to speech, right? As money as speech. It's corporate constitutional rights that have gone unchecked for, over 100 years have built the foundation where this power, I mean, even if you look at our immigration, for example, what does it mean to be a citizen in a country where corporations have the exact same rights as human beings? However, the Supreme Court has also decided that money, that they must make money, they must make profits, right? So the structure that must, whose number one priority is making money, um, having these same rights. So if we don't look at that long-term vision, whether no election will matter, right? Unless we make these structural changes. And again, like I said, those material improvements in people's lives, like Austin was saying, he focused on what makes a difference in somebody's lives. What are, how is your quality of life? And making those material changes within those. So just wanted to
100%. Jenny, thank you so much for that. I'm going to come back to you first. I just want to thank Austin. I know that you have to bounce. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar tonight, and your insights have been invaluable. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone in attendance tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
And
everyone. Have a great night.
thank you. And Jenny, just to sort of round out our conversation, right, and sort of a continue in the vein of what you just mentioned, I'm wondering sort of what your thoughts are in terms of the lessons from Move to Amend's history and Move to Amend's organizing model, and what from that history and from that organizing model feels most relevant to today's fights against corporate power.
there is an ebb and flow, right? And we were talking about that ground game. I think it's really important to keep that we keep our eye on that long-term structural change. I think sometimes we get siloed and we're just looking at one poly crisis after another. It used to be one crisis after another, right? But now we're at this multiple into this poly crisis situation. And so I think in movement building and with that long-term goal, in fact, just like the ground game, you just changing the Constitution isn't going to do it, right? We need to have what happens the next day. We have to have a movement with a vision strong enough to where are we going? What are we prioritizing? What kind of world do we want to see? We know that we want to put people over profits, right? So these kind of, we want a livable planet. How do we get there? And together, I think is really important. Working together, highlighting and showing these wins, but recognizing that wins that it's going to continue in conflict, and to keep the narrative focused, that we do not stop when we get an electoral win, that we press on, and with the urgency that the moment requires. We accept, and we celebrate wins, but we can't sit on our laurels past then.
Thank you so much for that. And I do want to get us to the question and answer portion of our webinar for tonight. But before we do that, I have one last question that I want to sort of like do a lightning round of and hear everybody's pithy 10-second response to this question. And that is, how can we, as people who are in different parts of this movement, as investigative journalists, as activists, as people who are on the ground doing this work with Move to Amend, how can we connect the movement's long-term constitutional goals to immediate and local campaigns that are already underway in the neighborhoods and cities that we live in? Essentially, how do we make this fight applicable to the people around us in real life? And I'm just going to go with Cole because I see you first on my screen. So I'm starting with you.
Yeah, require more from your elected officials. Require that they, you know, be be cognizant of these of this issue when when you get into a ballot box. And I hate to say it, but I'm almost a single issue voter when it comes to are you do you work for the people or do you work for your funders? Sometimes it's hard to tell, but hopefully we can make it easier to tell and at the same time implement um, some structural and legislative uh, things to help that along, i.e., ranked choice voting, match funds, the like. But um, yeah, ask your elected officials about the We the People Amendment and the pledge to amend, which I've linked here in the chat. Pass.
Thank you, Cole. Jenny, I see you next on my screen.
Um, I think, like building that permanent infrastructure, creating ongoing organizations, donor bases, candidate pipelines from and really investing in the political education, I think is really important as well. And it's an ongoing thing. Controlling our narratives really important. You know, I think that like you said, like Austin said, they found out about the campaign through social media, but then he took action. And I think as we continue to take action, and we've seen last year, we saw great mass mobilizations. We need that sustained pressure, um, and the maintenance of maintaining our coalitions, recognizing that that those money interests and say the slowdowns, those credit pressures, what was happening in Ohio, and then calling them out, publicizing it, pointing the fingers to when you see it happening, and raising that up. I think that's really really important. And if the base building is done well, then it's a lot harder to co-opt and financially starve the movements. So just continuing to make those connections with each other. I think we're starting to see an alignment of thought. Now we need to see an alignment of action.
Thank you, Jenny. Alfonso.
Yeah, I agree with what Go and Jenny have said. And I think that Mutual Man's deep historical dive shows us that people come to constitutional reform through local struggle. So I think it's really important to make those connections with everyday political frustration to the deeper rules that keep reducing those corporate powers. And I think that local campaign shows us the problem, and constitutional reform prevents that from keep on happening. So yeah, um, demand more from our local politicians and try to make those connections.
Megnan.
Yeah, I mean, we need people to understand, do you want your elected representatives to represent what many of you in your constituencies want, whatever size that constituencies want, or represent the interests of a select few just because they have more money than you do? And that could play out in many different ways. It could play out in local issues, municipal issues, state issues, national issues, right? Fundamentally, we're seeing on far too many issues, elected leaders choose positions that a majority of their constituents don't want. And one way to sort of course correct that would be to, at the times that they do that, issue by issue, no matter whether there's an upcoming election or not, for people to be reached out to and say, look, and for reporting also to reflect that, look, that this is what the majority of the constituents want, yet this is what the elected representative is doing. And I think that's the way to go ahead, especially in terms of reporting this out. We should constantly keep showing what popular sentiment on something is while representing what an elected is choosing to do.
And last but never least, Biplab.
Yeah, I feel like the first thing is to be crystal clear of what the goal is, what the objective is, and what is the problem here, which is that, some corporations have an outsized influence not only in elections but eventually in all policy in American life, right? And it's influencing your living every day. And the secondly is to, like, as a journalist, I consider it my duty to kind of, like, hold these powers to account. And beyond that, I feel like with movements like these, like, I feel it is important, as Cole mentioned earlier, to put pressure on your local representatives, your public representatives. And while you do that, take your neighbors, talk to them, take both your neighbors to them, and to kind of have that kind of organization. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for all that you've shared this evening, for just all your incredible insights. I think that you all have laid out a very compelling case, not just for why we, as people who are already on the ground, need to continue doing the work that we're doing, but why we need to engage our communities and families and friends around us to not only educate them about sort of like the effect of money in politics and how that's distorting our democracy, but also concrete ways that we can contribute to the solution. Thank you all so much for all that you've shared tonight. And we have a few questions sort of like in the chat that I wanted to get to sort of before we open it up to maybe other people raising their hand. But one question that's come up repeatedly is that given Mamdani's win and given the corporate interests that continue to organize against him and progressives across the country, do you all think that there might be something of an engineering of a quote unquote crime wave in New York City under the current mayoralty to dissuade people from voting for a progressive candidate again?
No,
Hot
I
take
mean, just to be
question.
short, so we can get to like more questions. Hopefully, I wouldn't engage in sort of fueling that conspiracy unless there's some substantiation to it. So far, there isn't.
I guess the question is perhaps like more broadly, do we think that corporate interests might play unfairly? Probably yes, probably. A biplab, I see you unmuted.
No, I was just going to say that they have already trying to, and like we already saw Bill Ackman, who was so nasty to Mamdani throughout the elections. Just the day after he won the elections, we saw him kind of post a very cozy message saying that we can work together, and that we'll see, like, once someone holds power, like, we will see them kind of try to influence, to try to be that. But I feel like the strength has to be in how people continue to hold both these corporations, but also Mamdani, now that is in power, to account as well. Like, will he, deliver his promises? Like, and it's important for journalists like me to also, like, question him if there's any misstep that he takes, like, and if he's actually causing up. So obviously, I as journalists understand it as my kind of responsibility to keep an eye out for something like that. And yeah, generally, I feel like. There will be attempts, and we see Partnership for New York, which is like the business partnership commemoration of like business in New York, has kind of now firmly stood behind Mamdani, and they say very openly that they are working very closely. We'll see. We'll keep an eye out how it plays out. It'll be interesting.
And Alfonso, how should we field questions from the audience? Can people raise their hands to indicate or?
Sure, I can unmute everybody who's on in the chat.
Well, we want everybody to stay muted until they talk, but
Yeah, I mean, let me make sure that they can unmute themselves. I think, yeah. So if anyone has questions, you should be able to unmute yourself.
I think I see Sue's hand up.
uh, put the question in the chat, and I'm wondering how we can even trust candidates when we reach out to them about move to amend, because, Mark Twain's quote about politicians not really being truthful. I don't remember the exact quote. But I think we all know that they will say anything to get elected and to appease their constituents, but then they still keep taking the corporate and special interest money. So how do we overcome this? It seems like a little bit of a catch-22 trying to reach out to candidates and politicians.
I can answer that. I think one way is like just more probity, and I mean, thankfully we still have good campaign finance laws, and there are issues of dark money, etc. But largely campaign finance sort of disclosures and stuff are very helpful in understanding which are the interests behind a particular candidate, be like whichever candidate across the spectrum. So I think one way is to keep track of that, and to have journalists keep track of that, and to have like rights organizations and advocacy organizations keep track of that, so that they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. And I mean, far too often we see that politicians don't do as they say they're going to do, and they vote differently in Congress versus what they say in their when they're going stumping. So yeah, I think a good way to do that is to just keep tracking what they're saying versus what the money they're getting and the votes that they're putting out.
Media also plays a big role here, that we need to keep exposing their campaigns and what they're doing with the, accepting the money. Thank you.
And one other thing is just real quick, Austin talked earlier about public campaign financing. If this is kind of down the road, and there's a lot that we need to address before then. But if we fundamentally rethought how we think about elections, somebody, the nature of an election, someone has to win, regardless of how much money is spent. And so, if there's public campaign financing or just these systems in place that we're talking about to limit the influence of money, maybe, just maybe, elections would become more about policy, and it'd be a lot easier to track that accountability. But again, these are pipe dreams at the current moment.
Thank you. And we might have time for one or two more questions if anyone has any. All right. Going once, going twice.
I would like to maybe answer, the idea about, do we anticipate some type of retaliation, whether it's corporate, billionaire, moneyed interest retaliation for a political win. Like you said, you don't see socialist dystopia busting out across Wall Street or anything, but or even that close to New York City. And I think anticipating that is really important. And we do have corporate capture of media in a big way. We have it's also identifying the voices and raising those up who are doing the important investigative journalism, and the publications that are there. Oh, I get it all the time. Well, if I can't watch this, where do I get the information? Where do I get this information? So, raising up those media, the community supported media, individual media, everything is our whole world. Like we're on a path of changing culture, right? We live in a corporate culture and changing that culture entirely. But also, it's really important to anticipate that retaliation and plan for it, and building the infrastructure to support pass the ballot, I think is important, and you know, a valid concern, and important to in that visionary way of how you can counterbalance those.
Thank you so much for that, Jenny. Again, thank you all so much for being a part of tonight's panel. You all have been truly amazing, just true luminaries, true visionaries. I know that we've all learned an immense amount from all that you've shared. And again, thank you all so much, for being here. A round of applause for our panelists. And also a round of applause for all of you in the audience out there in New York City and around the world. We are so thankful for your presence, for your support, and we just hope that you take what you've learned today forward into your friend groups, families, and communities, spread the knowledge and get people engaged with Move to Amend and other organizations that are working towards campaign finance reform. And if you should so happen to have the opportunity to vote for someone who's running on a platform of campaign finance or who is pledging to not take corporate donations, I don't know, maybe give them a try, look them up, see if their policies align. They might be worth it. But again, thank you all so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. My name is Kylie Madhav, and thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Fantastic job, Kylie. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, everyone.
So
Thank you, Kylie.